The clamor of a door locking echoes from nowhere, even though the room is already sealed. Listen. No, don't lean closer. Pretend you didn't hear that. The hinge did not cry out, it remembered. A sound can be a paradox like that, carrying age the way bone carries calcium. And yet here we are, standing before a wall that insists it has always been solid. I'm going to tell you something you were never meant to know, and I'll do it quietly, as if the walls themselves are eavesdropping. The records say 1890. The records always say something neat. Dates are tidy, suffering is not. In the basement of an asylum whose name has been scrubbed into a vestige, half legible, half denied, there was a room without a window, a room without a ledger entry, an oubliette masquerading as care, a place designed to forget and to make forgetting feel like mercy. I should warn you, I am not a reliable guide. I trust paper less than dust. I trust the silence most of all, because silence never lies, it only withholds. The corridor outside that room was sepulchral, a throat of brick swallowing light. Boots scraped along the floor not as footsteps, but as apologies. The men who passed through, orderlies, doctors, inspectors, left fingerprints of malice they pretended were kindness. Their hands trembled not from fear, no, but from the way their breath came shallow and jagged, sawing at the air as if it were wood that refused to split. At the threshold, the temperature fell. Not dramatically, it withdrew, like a body pulling its warmth inward when it decides not to survive. The air carried a smell, iron and damp linen, the copper tang of old blood. It wasn't on the floor, it was on the underside of the bed frame. Touch the wall and feel it, chalky, flaking, a texture like dried milk on a child's cup left too long in the sun. It powders your fingers, insists on being remembered. They said the patient was dangerous. They always do. The word is a blank check. They said the mind was inscrutable, that observation required isolation, that isolation required time. 30 years is not time. It is an ossuary of days stacked carelessly, skull upon skull, each identical in the dark. I've read the inspection reports. I've traced the ink where it hesitated, where the pen dug too hard and tore the page. I've followed the omissions, the way one name is struck through and never replaced. A room sealed, a life reduced to a margin note. And the narrator, me, standing here pretending the facts are enough. But facts are timid creatures. They scuttle when the light comes on. The asylum closed, fires cleanse what paper cannot. New walls were raised, then newer ones, until the old corridors became rumors beneath the floor. When they finally broke through, when steel met brick and the clamor returned, the smell changed again. The damp chill sharpened, threaded with something sweet and wrong, like apples left to rot in a cellar that has learned your name. What they found inside that room has been argued over for more than a century. Bones, scratches, a body folded into the corner like a letter never sent, or something worse, a proof that forgetting does not end a thing, it preserves it. I shouldn't tell you this next part. I can feel the wall breathing. At the 20-second mark, right now, under the last layer of whitewash, beneath the calcified apologies of 100 years, there was a mark that did not belong to the builders, a mark that suggested the room had been answering back. What does a sealed room say when it's finally allowed to speak?
Paper does not scream, but tonight it tried. The archive was not a room so much as a concession, a space the building surrendered when pressed. A bulb flickered overhead with the tired insistence of a pulse that knows it is being watched. Boxes lay stacked like coffins, their lids bowed, their corners softened by damp. When the archivist slid one free, the sound was not cardboard against wood, but bone on bone, an ossuary of files. I tell you this as if I was there alone. I wasn't. The silence had company. The ledger weighed more than it should have. That's how you know it mattered. Its spine cracked when opened, releasing a smell of mildew and ink, a sweet fungal breath, like rain soaking old books in a cellar. The temperature dipped again, a quiet subtraction. Fingers grew numb. The skin along the knuckles tightened, paper dry as if bracing. Page after page, admissions, diagnoses, discharges. Names marched in orderly columns until they didn't, until one line stuttered. A date, 1890, then a blank where a name should be. A hand had paused there, long enough for the ink to pool, then scraped forward without permission. A vestige of hesitation you could feel through the paper, raised like a scar. Someone tried to erase it, not cleanly, not kindly. The erasure left a ghost, a palimpsest that caught the light and refused to let go. The narrator in me wants to insist this is common. It isn't. Records prefer to lie cleanly. The smell changed as the page turned. Dust and something metallic, the copper tang of old blood leached into pulp. The margin notes grew frantic, cramped. Observe, isolate, for their safety. The word dangerous appeared once, then again, each time pressed harder until the pen bit through and kissed the desk beneath. At the bottom of the page, a final instruction. Room sealed. Why write an instruction if no one is meant to read it? Who was the instruction really for, the staff or the room itself? They found the corridor by mistake. Renovation does that. It disrespects intent. When the floor was opened, cold breathed up from below, a damp chill that carried the smell of lime and rust. The air tasted old, the kind of old that clings to the tongue and refuses to rinse away. Brickwork emerged, sepulchral and sweating. The mortar had softened to paste. When a hand brushed it, the texture yielded, leaving the imprint of fingers that looked too much like a plea. The clamor of tools echoed and returned thinner, altered, as if the walls were deciding which sounds to keep. Halfway down, the temperature dropped again, not a draft, a decision. Breath clouded, the light wavered and steadied on a door that was not on any plan. No handle, no keyhole, just iron straps bolted deep, their heads furred with corrosion. Touch them and feel the grit scrape your skin raw. The unreliable part of me wants to tell you the door was quiet. It wasn't. It ticked, a soft rhythmic sound, like nails tapping wood. Not frantic, patient. 30 years can teach patience to anything. Scratches scored the bricks around the frame, shallow at first, then deeper, then careful again, as if whoever made them learned restraint. Lines overlapped, intersected, formed patterns that looked almost intentional, almost letters. The smell thickened here. Damp wool, stale sweat, and beneath it something sweet and wrong, like apples forgotten in a locked drawer. A worker knelt to peer closer. His breath shortened, hitched. The skin at his temples shone. He pressed his lips together until they whitened. His gloved fingers curled inward, digging into the leather until the seams complained. He did not step back. He leaned in, as if listening. The door answered with a sound too small to be called a knock. Was it always making that sound, or did it learn when someone finally paid attention? What teaches a sealed thing when to speak? Official reports love clarity. This one wore it like a disguise. The inspection team arrived with clipboards and practiced indifference. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, the temperature cool, the smell damp. words that sanded down edges. But the photographs betrayed them. In one, the brickwork near the floor appeared darker, slick. In another, a pale smear crossed the door, chalky and uneven, as if something had been pressed there repeatedly until the wall learned the shape of a shoulder. They scraped a sample. The sound was wrong, soft like peeling dried paint from skin. The dust clung to the gloves, refusing to fall. When it did, it left a faint stain. Later, under better light, they would call it residue, calcium, organic matter, the vocabulary of avoidance. The report mentions a finding, singular. It does not list bones. It does not list a body. Instead, it describes a space modified by prolonged occupation. The phrase is bloodless and precise. It tells the truth without admitting it. Inside the room, yes, they opened it. The air was warmer. Not by much, enough to notice, enough to make the hairs on the forearm rise, as if recognizing kinship. The smell was intimate now, breath trapped for decades, stale and human, braided with the mineral bite of brick. The floor was smooth in places, worn down to a polish by movement repeated until it became prayer. On the wall opposite the door, marks, not random, counted. Days, perhaps, were something else. The spacing changed over time, tighter, then wider, then careful again. Malice had not done this, endurance had. In the corner, a hollow, not dug, made. The wall bowed inward, softened, shaped by contact. A nest is too gentle a word. An oubliette learns from what it keeps. They left quickly. Boots scuffed, papers rustled. Outside, the air felt too loud. The clamor of the world rushed back in, obscene in its abundance. The report was filed. The door was resealed. The room returned to its vigil. And the narrator, me, wants to reassure you that this is where it ends. It isn't. Because one photograph was mislabeled, one sample was misplaced, one page of the ledger was never returned to its box. And sometimes, late at night, the archive smells faintly of apples. If nothing was found, why did something come back with them?
Chalk does not grow, yet these lines had multiplied. They returned with lights strong enough to shame shadows. Flood lamps bloomed white against brick, and the room recoiled, not metaphorically. The temperature shifted in pockets, warm near the floor, colder at shoulder height, like breath settling after a long confession. The smell sharpened, damp stone braided with the copper tang of old blood and the faint sweetness of decay held politely at bay. The markings were counted again, and again. The numbers refused to behave. Each line had a width, a pressure, a personality. Early marks were shallow, tentative, as if the hand had not yet decided to stay. Later ones dug deeper, confident, the chalky dust compacted into the grooves by repeated touch. Texture mattered here. Run a fingertip along the wall and feel the ridges, some smooth as river stone, others jagged, tearing skin until it bloomed red. The wall remembered every decision. A junior inspector whispered the count. He stopped, started over. His breath came in short pulls, ribs hitching, as if the air had grown thick. He pressed his lips together until the muscles in his jaw trembled. The tally changed depending on where you began. The wall had been edited. There were symbols among the lines, curves tucked between counts, intersections that suggested letters but resolved into nothing readable. Inscrutable, yes, but consistent. Someone had learned a private grammar. Someone had taught the wall to listen. In the corner hollow, the brick was darker, polished by contact. The smell there was intimate and wrong, stale breath, old sweat, lime. The temperature rose a fraction, enough to fog glass, enough to make you aware of your own heat, your own vulnerability to being learned by a room. A chalk nub lay on the floor, too intact, too recent. If the room was sealed,
Who had been counting? When numbers don't add up, what are they measuring instead? The ledger page surfaced where it shouldn't have, slid between invoices like a stowaway with no patience for secrecy. The paper had absorbed moisture unevenly, buckled like skin after long immersion. When unfolded, it released a smell of mildew and ink, and beneath that, the faint mineral bite of dust scraped from brick. This time, the blank had changed. A name pressed through the erasure, not fully restored but stubborn. Letters emerged as if coaxed by pressure from behind the page. The ink was thinner here, diluted, the strokes tentative, then decisive. A surname repeated in the margins, abbreviated, crossed, written again. The pen had argued with itself. Dates clustered, intervals shortened, observations grew spare. Responsive to sound, counts aloud, responds when counted with. The language was clinical, but the rhythm betrayed it. Someone had been listening. Someone had been answered. The archivist's hands shook, not with fear, no, but with effort. Fingertips whitened as they pinched the page, nails biting into skin until crescents bloomed. The room around us cooled, the bulb dimmed. The smell of apples crept in again, sweet and wrong, a cellar scent with a memory attached. There was a sketch at the bottom of the page, not a face, a room, a door with iron straps, lines on the wall. In the corner, a shaded curve that suggested a hollow shaped by patience. Next to it, a word written small enough to miss. Vestige. The ledger snapped shut on its own. The clamor echoed thinly, swallowed by stacks of boxes that leaned closer, as if eavesdropping. The unreliable part of me insists this was coincidence. Coincidences don't leave fingerprints. If the name had survived the erasure, what else had learned to come back? What does a buried name do when it remembers itself? They tested the room the way you test a suspect, by lying to it. A metronome was set on the floor outside the door. Tick, tock. The sound slid under iron and brick, a thin blade of time. Inside, the air warmed again, subtle but measurable. The smell shifted towards damp wool and chalk dust. The wall nearest the corner hollow seemed to drink the sound, the texture there softening as if the brick had learned to bruise. They counted aloud, slowly, evenly. The clamor of numbers filled the corridor, echoed, returned, altered. On 7, the tick faltered. On 9, something answered. Not a voice, a pressure. The wall pulsed. Dust fell in a careful line. A mark appeared where none had been, chalky, fresh, exact. The temperature spiked enough to prickle skin. Breath caught. Someone swallowed hard, the sound loud as a confession. They stopped the metronome. Silence rushed in, thick and expectant. The smell of apples intensified, sweet rot and memory. In the corner hollow, a darker smear gathered, not wet but willing, a place that had been shaped to receive. The report would later describe environmental response. The photograph would show a new line on the wall, perfectly spaced between two older ones. The chalk nub would be gone. They resealed the door again. Of course they did. Malice wears procedure like a uniform. Outside, daylight felt obscene. The world clattered on, generous and loud. But the counting did not stop. It simply learned to wait. If a room can answer, what question has it been practicing for 30 years?
Something shifted beneath the floor, and the building pretended it hadn't. They began with the floor because the walls had grown opinionated. A single tile near the corner hollow rang differently under the mallet, a dull clack swallowed by something softer beneath. When lifted, the temperature rose in a sigh, warm air exhaling like a mouth that had been sealed too long. The smell followed, dust, damp lime, and a copper tang that clung to the back of the throat. Old blood does not announce itself, it insinuates. Beneath the tile, not soil,
Not rubble, order. Small objects laid in rows, nested like teeth in a jaw. Buttons first, bone, mother of pearl, iron eaten thin by years. Then slivers of wood, whittled smooth by touch. Then fragments that required no imagination at all. Phalanges. Not many, enough. Their surfaces were polished, not by tools, but by handling, repeated until the skin learned a ritual. An ossuary assembled with patience, not panic. The texture of the floor cavity was wrong, brick edges softened, mortar worn down as if fingers had passed there every day, counting, aligning, correcting. The warmth pooled here, a degree or two above the rest of the room, enough to fog lenses and make the hairs along the forearm lift. Breath came short, lips pressed thin. One inspector steadied himself by digging his nails into his palm until a bead of red surfaced, bright and immediate, alive. They tried to number the objects. The count refused to settle. Additions appeared between visits. A button where none had been. A sliver rotated a fraction, aligning itself with a logic no one could quite see. Inscrutable, but consistent. The room had learned curation. A note was found beneath a bone fragment, paper reduced to pulp, but still legible where ink had bitten deep. A date repeated, then crossed out, rewritten, crossed again, time arguing with itself. If days can be stored, what happens when they start rearranging themselves? Who was keeping the calendar, the patient or the room? They brought a recorder this time. Machines, unlike people, are supposed to be honest. The device was placed just inside the door, angled toward the corner hollow. When powered on, it emitted a soft hum that threaded through the brick like a wire. The temperature dipped near the threshold and climbed near the wall, a gradient, intentional. The smell shifted again, damp wool, chalk dust, and the sweetness of apples pressed too long into storage. They played voices, men first, authority in the timbre, commands disguised as care. The wall did nothing. Then a woman's voice, reading numbers with the careful cadence of instruction. On 5, the chalk line nearest the floor deepened, edges crumbling as if rubbed from the inside. On 8, dust fell in a precise arc, sketching a new mark that matched the grammar of the others. Breath hitched. Someone coughed, a dry bark that scraped the throat. The recorder's levels spiked. The hum wavered. A second sound emerged beneath it, soft, rhythmic, patient. Nails on brick, or the memory of nails, rehearsed. They stopped playback. Silence thickened. The warmth lingered. The smell grew intimate, human. The recorder continued to capture something after the button was pressed. Residual noise, they would call it. A pattern like counting backwards. When they reviewed the audio later, there were words in the noise. Not spoken, implied. Gaps shaped like syllables, a cadence that suggested a response, waiting for the right prompt. The unreliable part of me wants to insist pareidolia. The wall insists otherwise. If a room answers only certain voices, what does it recognize in them? Who taught the room which voices to trust? They staged the past because it refused to stay buried. Period furniture was sourced, bed frame, basin, a chair with a split rung repaired badly and left that way on purpose. The room cooled as objects crossed the threshold, then warmed again, accepting them with a familiarity that prickled skin. The smell shifted toward iron and soap, the copper tang threading through like a refrain. They placed the bed where scuff marks suggested it had always been. The chair fit the hollow perfectly, as if measured. When the basin was set down, a faint ring appeared beneath it, chalky and exact, a vestige of countless refills. Water introduced into the room did not stay level. It leaned toward the corner. The reconstruction team moved carefully, breaths shallow, steps measured, fingertips brushed brick and recoiled, powdered white. The texture here had changed, smoother, warmer, almost yielding. A handprint appeared where none had been moments before, not wet, not dry, but impressed, as if the wall had been waiting for the pressure to complete itself. They played a recording of a clock. Tick. The room ticked back. Not sound, movement. The chalk lines advanced by one, a clean addition that slotted itself between others without disturbing the count. The calendar updated itself. A photograph captured the moment. Later, when enlarged, a detail emerged in the corner hollow, a curve like a shoulder, a shadow with edges too intentional to dismiss. The report called it artifact. The wall called it practice. They ended the reconstruction early, procedures cited, safety invoked. Malice wears caution like a halo. As the door closed, the temperature spiked one last time, a brief flush of warmth, like a body leaning forward. The smell of apples surged, sweet and urgent, then withdrew. The clamor of bolts echoed, thinner than before. If the room can rehearse the past, what is it preparing to perform?
A draft moved the dust, though no opening existed. They searched for a way out because the room suggested one. Blueprints were unrolled, their edges curled like old leaves. Lines intersected where corridors should have continued, then stopped. Clean, decisive terminations that felt less like design and more like refusal. A gap appeared on one plan, a narrow rectangle penciled lightly, then inked over. The temperature in the archive dipped as the page was smoothed flat. The smell of paper, dry, acidic, mingled with damp stone and the faint sweetness that had begun to follow us. Behind the west wall, a void answered the tap test, hollow, expectant. When the brick was removed, the air rushed in with a damp chill that carried the copper tang of old blood and the mineral bite of lime. The texture inside the cavity was wrong, softened brick, edges rounded by contact, as if a passage had been attempted with bare hands and then persuaded not to exist. Marks scored the cavity walls, not scratches, directions, arrows worn thin by repetition. A map that led nowhere because nowhere was safer. The smell intensified here, apples and rust, a cellar scent layered over something intimate. The warmth pooled low, ankle height, as if something had learned where to wait. They found a shoe sole wedged between bricks, leather reduced to a flexible shadow. No foot bones, no laces, just the idea of walking, preserved. The ossuary below the floor rearranged itself overnight. A button migrated closer to the cavity, aligning with an arrow. If an exit was attempted and erased, who convinced it to stay erased? What does a room gain by keeping what tries to leave? Incidents require witnesses. This one had too many. A contractor lingered after hours, measuring twice, muttering counts under his breath like a charm. The corridor cooled around him, the temperature withdrawing in layers. The smell sharpened, chalk dust and damp wool, apples swelling sweetly at the edge of nausea. His breath shortened. He rubbed his hands together, skin rasping dry, then pressed his palms to the wall to steady himself. The wall pressed back. Not a shove, a suggestion. The texture softened under his fingers, yielding a fraction, then firming again, as if testing grip. He laughed, a thin sound that cracked and died. His nails dug into brick until white dust bloomed and skin split. When he pulled away, the wall kept the shape of his hand, a pale impression that lingered, chalky and exact. The recorder caught the sound, a soft knock from the inside, answering his. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, a pattern that matched nothing in the reports and everything in the wall. He fled. Boots clattered. The clamor echoed thin and distorted, swallowed by brick that seemed to lean closer. Later, in the infirmary, his pulse raced while his skin stayed cold. He kept counting backwards until someone made him stop.
The incident report lists paresthesia and panic. It omits the handprint. The photograph of the corridor shows a new chalk line at shoulder height. If the room can touch back, where does it learn restraint? What happens when the room decides not to be gentle? They closed it tighter. Of course they did. Steel plates were added, bolts sunk deep. Sealant filled every seam, a chemical stink overlaying the familiar palette of damp stone and apple-sweet rot. The temperature stabilized, obedient on paper. The smell, however, lingered, seeping into clothes, hair, memory. The texture on the wall beneath the sealant continued to change, minute shifts that made tools sing when drawn across it. Before the final plate went on, someone noticed a new mark on the floor, chalky and fresh. Not a line, a circle. In the center, a small hollow, perfectly cupped. The ossuary below responded. A phalange rotated to point upward, aligning with the circle as if answering a summons. They ignored it. Procedures cited, time pressed. Malice wears schedules like armor. When the last bolt turned, a warmth bloomed behind the steel, brief and intimate. The recorder, left on by accident, captured a sound after everyone had gone. A soft exhale, followed by counting. Forward, steady, patient. The exit that was never built remained unnecessary. The room had learned a better way. If the room doesn't need a door, what is it waiting to open?
The walls knew their name before anyone spoke it aloud. The name surfaced again, this time where it had no right to be, chalked faintly on a beam in the service tunnel, half smeared, half insistent. Letters stacked and restacked as if practicing how to be remembered. The temperature in the tunnel dipped, then warmed, the air brushing skin with a clammy intimacy. The smell followed, dust and iron, damp wool, apples swelling sweetly in the dark. The admission form contradicted itself. Ink density changed mid-line. The handwriting shifted, steadier after the diagnosis than before. Responsive to structure, it read. Counts to regulate breath. In the margin, a correction. Counts to regulate the building. The pen had pressed so hard on that word it embossed the page beneath. Textures told the rest. Fingertips traced raised letters, nails catching where the paper tore microscopically. Someone had returned to this page often, their touch polishing the fibers. The ledger had learned the shape of their worry. There were sketches now, rooms connected by arrows that bent, corridors annotated with numbers that matched the chalk grammar. The room wasn't the patient, the building was the curriculum. Inscrutable, yes, but methodical, a syllabus written in brick. If the building was being studied, who assigned the lessons? Was the patient learning the room or teaching it? They searched for remains because closure demands something to bury. Ground-penetrating scans lit the floor in ghostly layers. Anomalies clustered where warmth had always pooled. The smell sharpened as cores were pulled. Lime and dust, copper threaded through like a refrain. The texture of the extracted plugs was wrong, too smooth, edges rounded as if worn by handling rather than time. They found calcium, plenty of it, distributed, not arranged like a skeleton, but like residue, powdered, smeared, integrated into mortar. The ossuary below had thinned, pieces missing, relocated upward as if the room had decided on a different storage strategy. A lab report used careful language, biological incorporation. The phrase tasted chalky in the mouth. The building had eaten without teeth. The temperature spiked during sampling, brief flushes of warmth that fogged goggles and quickened breath. Someone steadied themselves by gripping a beam until splinters bit skin. Blood beaded, bright and immediate. The beam darkened where it touched, absorbing the color with interest. No body emerged, no coffin moment. The absence felt curated, a hollow where something had been, shaped too well to be accidental. If there is no body left to find, where did the patient go?
When a place consumes a person, does it inherit their habits? A memo surfaced, misfiled and tired. Transfer approved, it read, dated years after the sealing. Destination blank. The ink bled through, feathering into the page beneath like roots seeking water. The smell of the paper was sharp, chemical, fighting the familiar damp sweetness that crept closer as the room was mentioned. Security footage, much later, grainy, showed a corridor empty except for a shadow that did not match any body. The temperature readouts dipped as it passed. Chalk lines appeared along the baseboards in its wake, exact and patient, counting without sound. They sealed more rooms, closed wings, blamed budgets. Malice wears neglect like a virtue. In the original room, behind steel and sealant, the counting changed cadence, faster at night, slower near dawn. The recorder captured words in the gaps, still not spoken but shaped, inside, together, learned. The unreliable part of me wants to insist metaphor. The building insists continuity. If the patient was transferred, what exactly made the journey?
The lights flickered, and something counted the darkness between them. They called it a routine inspection. Routine is a word that dulls blades. By the time the inspectors arrived, the building had learned to anticipate them. The temperature equalized unnaturally, a careful neutrality that felt rehearsed. The smell, however, betrayed the effort. Damp stone overlaid with disinfectant, apples sweetening beneath, the copper tang of old blood threading through like a basso continuo. Footsteps entered the corridor and returned altered, softened, as if the walls were sanding them down. One inspector paused, palm pressed to brick, fingers splayed. The texture pulsed, subtle, almost courteous. He withdrew his hand and wiped it on his coat, leaving a chalky smear that looked too much like a signature. They followed the checklist. Seals intact, plates secure, recorders installed. When the steel was tapped, the sound came back wrong, not hollow, not solid, but layered. A clamor folded into itself. The temperature spiked behind the plate for half a second, enough to prickle skin and steal breath. Probably pressure, someone muttered. The unreliable narrator in me agrees aloud and disagrees internally. The smell changed mid-sentence. Wool and lime receded. Apples surged, ripe and urgent. The inspector's breathing shortened. One cleared his throat repeatedly, a dry rasp that left his voice frayed. Fingernails dug into clipboards until plastic creaked. A new chalk line appeared at knee height while they stood there. No one saw it form. Everyone noticed it existed. If the building prepares for inspections, what has it learned about authority? Who is inspecting whom? They tried a different tactic, interrogation without a subject. A speaker was set against the steel. Questions were read aloud, measured, calm. State your name, state the date, state your condition. The words slid into the room and did not return, absorbed like water into chalk. On the floor, dust shifted into a shallow spiral, grains aligning with care. The temperature warmed near the speaker, a localized flush like a cheek coloring. The smell of apples thickened until it coated the tongue. They asked about pain, about duration, about consent. The wall responded by adding 2 lines where one should have been, a correction. The cadence changed, faster, more confident. Someone's breath hitched. They pressed their lips together until they shook. A pen slipped from a hand and rolled to the corner hollow, stopping exactly at its lip, as if placed.
The recorder captured something under the questions, a rhythm that matched the inspector's pulse. The building had learned biofeedback. They asked the last question by mistake. "Do you want to leave?" The temperature dropped hard. The smell snapped to iron and damp wool. The chalk dust stilled. After a pause long enough to be counted, a circle appeared on the floor, then another, then a third. Not exits, centers. If a room answers desire with geometry, what does it understand about freedom? What did the building mean by center? The closure notice was drafted that afternoon. Indefinite suspension, structural instability cited, funds redirected. Malice wears economics like a mask. As they packed, the building relaxed, the temperature smoothed, the smell receded to its baseline: stone, dust, apples waiting. In the service tunnel, the chalked name blurred, letters smudging into a shape that suggested movement rather than identity. One inspector lingered. He stood very still, counting under his breath. His shoulders rose and fell unevenly. The wall nearest him warmed, just enough. A chalk line appeared at chest height, matching the rhythm of his count. He stopped counting. The line stopped growing. He left without filing his addendum. That night, the recorders captured a new sound layered beneath the familiar counting. Footsteps, not walking away, circling, learning the perimeter. If the inspection never truly ends, what verdict is the building waiting to deliver?
A sigh rose from the sealed walls, though no air moved. Decades later, when curiosity overcame protocol, the final steel plate was removed. The temperature shifted immediately, uneven, as if the room exhaled after holding its breath for 30 years. The smell greeted them first: damp lime, iron, and the pervasive sweetness of apples that had rotted just enough to smell alive again. The walls were thick with markings, lines, spirals, numbers, letters that weren't letters. Some were deep and confident, others shallow, tentative, like the room had tried to forget itself before remembering again. The floor, the hollow corners, the ossuary beneath the tiles, all had been rehearsing, counting, cataloging decades of absence. Every surface pulsed with memory. A beam of sunlight fell across the corner hollow. Dust swirled in the light. In the air, a faint pressure, like a presence pressed just behind the spine. The chalk lines shifted minutely, perfectly aligned with the angle of light. Someone's fingers traced one line. The wall yielded ever so slightly, soft enough to leave an imprint, as if it had been waiting for touch. If the room remembered touch, could it remember the hand that pressed first? Who truly inhabited this room, the patient or the building itself? The ledger, found misfiled under floorboards, had aged but retained a stubborn rigidity. Each page was a map of obsession: dates, counts, annotations. The ink, faded and brittle, still held impressions of fingertips pressed long ago. Margins bore subtle indentations, forming patterns invisible until shadows struck just right. They tried reading it aloud. The temperature shifted again, an almost imperceptible rise in the far corner. The wall near the hollow responded, chalk dust lifting into tiny eddies. Words began to form from the dust itself, rearranging the lines into something intelligible. I am still counting. I am still learning. I am still here. The smell intensified, the sharp tang of copper, damp wool, and the sickly sweetness of rotting apples merging into an atmosphere that clung to lungs, tongue, and skin. The texture of the walls seemed to absorb observation. The more they looked, the more the brick reshaped beneath their gaze.
If the ledger speaks, does the room answer, or does it question? What can a sealed room teach when the world outside insists on forgetting? When the door was finally resealed, this time for good, the room had changed irreversibly. It held more than absence now. It held knowledge, pattern, memory, almost consciousness. Every temperature shift, every smell, every texture was a record of what had passed through it. The chalk lines, the hollow, the ossuary, they were not abandoned. They were active, waiting, rehearsing their own history. Outside, investigators, historians, and curious trespassers would speak of anomalies. They would describe the room as haunted or psychologically disturbing. But the truth is quieter, subtler. The room had learned. It counted, it recorded, it remembered. The patient may have vanished from our records, yet the room became the custodian of everything: life, absence, touch, breath. The walls, the floor, the hollow, they were the patient now. A faint clamor echoed from the steel behind the final seal, a whisper almost imperceptible, counting, shifting, learning. The apple's scent lingered, a reminder that the room remembers sweetness even after decay. The temperature pulsed once like a heartbeat, and somewhere, deep beneath the tiles, a single phalange rotated, aligning with the last chalk circle. If a room can remember, what does it dream? And when no one is watching, does it ever sleep, or continue counting for eternity?